People claim that there's more Christian martyrs than ever before. But is that true? Welcome to The Conquering Truth. I'm Dan Horn.
I'm Roger Booten.
I'm Charles Churchill.
And I'm Joshua Horn.
Recently, Cliffe Knechtle was interviewed by Tucker Carlson, and he made this comment.
The 20th century had more Christian martyrs than all the centuries before that combined.
Yeah, I noticed.
Yep.
That's not talked about too much.
Yeah, really?
Yeah.
Since the year 2000, over 50,000 Nigerian Christians have been slaughtered by terrorists for their faith in Christ. Beheaded right outside the church or inside the church building. That's tragic. That is so sick, so sad, and yet it's real. And yet I'm convinced that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. I'm convinced that to spread Christianity, I must not kill others, but be willing to die for my faith. To be killed.
So this isn't intended to be a critique of everything that was said on that podcast, but this is a statistic that is often given. It was even given in the U.S. Congress about the number of, I think somebody said 52,000 Christians in Nigeria had been persecuted and were killed. And there is serious terrorism that's going on. But at the same time, to turn around and say that this is persecution of the church, it has a real serious cause and effect problem. But before we even start to talk about that, let's define what is persecution. What is martyrdom? Is just dying and calling yourself a Christian, does that make you a martyr?
Well, I think the important thing to look at when you think about this is that the truth matters. Accuracy matters. So if somebody says they were baptized but they weren't really a believer, we did an episode on that. That they weren't baptized, they just got wet. If a group of people claimed to be in another country and they were killed and they said they were Americans, but they weren't Americans, that makes a big difference between how the administration, any administration, would respond to that. So it is incredibly important to understand, were these people actually believers? And this doesn't take away from the fact that it was a tragedy that this many people have been killed. I mean, that is terrible that this many people have been killed. But if we're mislabeling it, we're not only doing a disservice to the people in Nigeria who are seeing that, we're doing a disservice to the church in large, saying this is what a martyr is if in fact they are not martyr. If they're not a believer, then they're not a martyr. And just because they called themselves a believer and maybe somebody wanted their land and they killed them, that doesn't mean they're a martyr. That just means they were unjustly murdered.
And, it's about Nigeria, which is looked at as the country where the most martyrdom has happened. And all four of us have been to Nigeria one time or the other. I've been over 20 times. So it's not like we don't know what's going on. The bishop that testified before the U.S. Congress, I've been in his city, and there's actually very little death that happened in that city that he's from in that area. And so they have these people that come, and yes, we can have great sympathy that they're being terrorized, because there's no question they're being terrorized. But Cliffe Knechtle then doesn't leave it there. He goes that they're dying in churches and they're dying right outside of churches. That's not what's usually happening. I'm not saying that never happens, but that's not how most of the people have been killed by the Fulani and by Boko Haram. It hasn't been right inside churches. Sometimes they flee to churches so that they are collected together, because that would be the natural gathering place. But usually what they do is they flee out into the wilderness, because that's where, if you go out into the wild, it's hard to find them. It's hard to trace them. So usually as soon as the Fulani come in, everybody flees to the woods, basically, is where protection is, much more than the church. And so, understand, I've talked to people who 3 weeks before, they had the Fulani attack and kill half of the people in their villages. I mean, this isn't like I'm talking about people that are remote. And I remember that conversation with one of those people right afterwards. And I did a conference with a group of pastors from a denomination, Echo, which is one of their more faithful denominations. And by the end of my afternoon of teaching them, half of the people in the room said they weren't Christians, that they had never heard the gospel before. And this is one of the more faithful denominations. And so we've just got this idea that you can just call them martyrs because they called themselves Christians. I loved your example of America wouldn't invade a country because 50,000 people called themselves Americans if they weren't Americans. Ronald Reagan invaded Grenada because there were Americans that were in the medical school there, and he goes, I have to protect Americans because they're citizens. Well, if they just called themselves Americans and weren't Americans, he wouldn't have invaded. And so much of this is trying to inspire the church without the church actually caring whether they are actually testifying who Christ is or not.
When I think of martyr, you look at the early church, you look at the Reformation martyrs, and even, I even heard of, modern day people where the situation is, you are captured and then you come to a point for many of them where they, or where the government or whoever it is challenges you, like, deny Christ and we'll set you free or we're going to kill you. So is that, have you heard of that really happening in Nigeria?
No. And part of it is, right, when we think of faith, if we think of what Christianity really is, Christianity is about producing an obedient, holy people. That's what Christ came and died for. He died to take away sin. Not that people will be perfect, but he died to take away sin. And so if the Muslims are attacking because they look at the Christians and they say they're more filthy than the Muslims are, and they're attacking them because of their filth and their moral perversion, would we call that martyrdom? And the reality is, in America, we do it all the time. You look at the Muslims, and I'm not saying they have a right to be terrorists. Do not get me wrong. They're still murdering people. They're murderers. But at the same time, they are offended by the so-called Christians in their perversion, their theft, their lying, their adultery, their fornication. They're looking at them and saying, these are filthy people that are affecting our religion, is part of the reason that they're killing them. Not because they're saying, follow Jesus Christ, but because they're not following Jesus Christ.
And the bigger thing is that God is seeing that same wickedness, and he's the one who's deciding to have this terror come upon it. Because it is terrorism. When he describes them as Muslim terrorists, that is true. Nigeria is northern half generally Muslim, southern half generally Christian, quote unquote Christian, professing Christian, and there is real Muslim terrorism attacking especially the border area Christians. That part of it is true, and 52,000. I don't know the exact numbers, but that number is not implausible.
Right, of those number of people that died, because there is a very serious range war going on in Nigeria. The question is it actually based on religion, or is it just based on group affinity, as opposed to what you actually believe and what you actually practice? And I see very little, and I'm not saying there's no cases, but I've seen no evidence that there's cases. We've had conferences with thousands of pastors, and I think almost none of them actually understand the gospel. Forget following it. Just understanding it. They have so little understanding of the gospel when you go there.
When you think about this, what you're saying is it would be absolutely fine to have, if you want to have pity on people in Nigeria, perfectly appropriate. But if you're watching what Knechtle's argument was, he's saying this is the strength of Christianity in the world. There were more martyrs than there have ever been in any other time in the world. And the problem is that argument just isn't true. And I think most people are used to mostly reacting through emotion. And so there's this part of it, when you hear about it, you basically go, oh my goodness, that's horrible. And the answer is that is horrible, but you don't want to then accept the logical argument, because the way people raise money off this is I was looking at ads today, it goes, stand with the Christians in Nigeria, stand with them. And there's this idea that they're over there standing for Christ, and that if you give money to some organization, you will be supporting their stand for Christianity, which is not what's happening, the money's not going to help them stand for Christianity. And
most of it's not even going to end in Nigeria.
Right, even if it got to them. And so there's this whole part of it where there's this whole chain of thought that needs to be disrupted. And the church actually needs to go, because in the end, the argument is the state of the church is strong. And the answer is the state of the church is not strong. And this is not an argument for why it is.
And it's really important to recognize how far this is from Christian martyrdom. because like we've done episodes on Voice of the Martyrs. Voice of the Martyrs, the early people that went through what they call the crisis, where people died, and it was mostly men that died. What happened in Voice of the Martyrs is they paid a man to go and pay widows to send their daughters and their sons to his school. And the mothers, in many cases, knew that their daughters were being raped, but they told their daughters to stay because they were getting $20 a month. They were prostituting their daughters for $20 a month. And they're called Christians. And these are the wives, the widows of people who died by the Boko Haram attacks. And that's exactly the class of people that we went and dealt with Voice of the Martyrs. And they're raising money going, oh, yeah, these are all martyrs. And they're prostituting their daughters for $20.
Well, Voice of the Martyrs is paying the rapist.
Right. And Voice of the Martyrs is paying the widows, too, the $20. Right. That's coming from Voice of the Martyrs. And so when we twist it and say that is martyrdom, it turns something very evil where there should be pity. There should be pity for these women that are in such desperate straits that they would prostitute their daughter, but they are not Christians in any way, shape, or form. They are so far from Christ. And again, I'm not saying everyone, but I'm saying the ones who were sending them to Stephen Center, that's surely the case.
And the thing, too, is, I mean, it is important to differentiate. Like you look back at the Crusades, and we wouldn't say that all the Crusaders were martyrs. In fact, most of them weren't. I mean, it was a war. There was, of course, the Christian versus Muslim. It was also territorial. It was also people wanting to get rich. I mean, there were a variety of reasons. But
people earning indulgences.
Right, exactly, yeah. And just going on the crusade and dying didn't make you a martyr. No matter what the Pope said about it,
the Pope said it made you. We've become like the papacy. As the Pope said, that made you a martyr, and now we say that makes you a martyr. The evangelical church in America isn't that much different than the papacy during the Crusades.
Right. The cruel truth of the Crusades was it was hard to go on the Crusades and be a martyr. Yeah. I mean not the other way around.
And one reason why it matters is because this isn't the first time that this has happened. And you even look in Scripture, and there's, God's people died. Even a majority of them died. A vast majority of them died. They were killed by heathens. But they were not martyrs. Because, it's happened several times. Jerusalem fell several times. When Israel is being attacked by the Babylonians, they are God's people, Jehovah's people. The other nations around them, they hate God. They're, in their minds, they're the holy people. Even more so in the 70 AD destruction of the temple, because they're not even doing that much idolatry of like their neighbors' gods. They're saying we're following Jehovah, and that's what they think. That's what it might look like to the outside. That's what you read. If you didn't have the Scripture, you might read the history books and say, wow, they were, look at them. They're all martyrs. They're all martyred for Christ. But you look at, the prophecies. The prophets are speaking to them saying, you're evil. God's going to come and judge you for your sin. And so they weren't martyrs. They were being killed by an enemy of a false religion. And, did some of the enemies even choose to do it and were more excited to kill them because they were, idolaters by worshiping the true God? Perhaps they did, but it doesn't make them martyrs, because we can't forget that there is this judgment metric that God sends death and destruction on Christians, not just as persecution for righteousness' sake, but being beaten for their faults. And we need to distinguish that for
so-called Christians, right, in a lot of cases,
sure.
Right? The true Christians, you don't suffer martyrdom the same way.
Right. But, yeah. But, there's people, there's
false martyrdom the same way.
Right. So it's important for the people who are there. It's important for us when we're thinking about it that we remember that God does judge. He judged in the Old Testament, he judged in the New Testament, and he can judge today as well.
It's important for us to go back to what does the word martyr mean, because we have created this wow, this is wonderful. They're a martyr, where we're talking about somebody who died for their faith. But the root of martyr is being a witness, right? It's like in Hebrews 12, 1 through 2, Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. A martyr is somebody who's testifying to the reality of who God is. They're walking in obedience to who God is. They're somebody who God is saying, look to them and walk the race like they walked it, run it like they walked it. They walked it focused on Christ. And you're supposed to look at that and say, how should I live? That's not what anybody should do with the people in Nigeria that are dying. You shouldn't look at them and say, this is how I should live. That's just not their testimony at all. Most so-called Christians in America, even the unbelieving ones that profess Christ in America, would look at how the Nigerian Christians, quote unquote, live, and they would go, I would never follow that example. You go to the marketplace and they lie to you all the time. The Christians do. They steal from you without hesitation. I mean, they're angry, they're bitter. I mean, they are not an example of how people should live at all. And so to turn around and say that they have a witness for who Christ is in their life, that's not what I've seen.
If you're listening, this sounds like dump on Nigerians.
No, but we dump on everybody, Charles. So that's not fair.
I understand. But
you want me to talk about other nations? I can.
No, I mean, and I think but the reason is because I think people just, you hear somebody say something and you go, that must be true. I mean, I remember when I went over to Nigeria, I would hear the stories before we would go, and then you go over there and you're gathered in a room full of, 3,000 pastors, and you open up Q&A, and the pastors start asking questions like, can I divorce my wife if she won't sleep with me? And can I, and is it okay if I go and have sex with another woman if my wife isn't sleeping with me? And then you hear people asking, going, I know other pastors who bribe people and do all these things. Is that okay to do? I mean, and you're sitting here going, and these are the questions they're willing to say out loud in front of everyone. And I was trying to find my notes because there were other questions that I didn't write down, that I didn't write them down because they shocked me. I was sitting there like going,
I'm so used to them they don't shock me anymore.
Right, but I mean, and these
You've
were
only been once, Charles. Yeah,
and these were pastors of the more conservative denominations. Because
Right.
there were denominations that we wouldn't even call together the pastors to, so you're trying to figure out who should I preach to and who should I do this with? And it's just completely different. I mean, so I think
you go to the conference that you were talking about, that when we went out to pass out food, I mean, the people were like fighting, right? I mean, they were like dogs fighting for food. I mean, and they knew they'd get served,
and not
but it
because they
doesn't
were
matter.
starving.
It's because they're going, I'm important. How dare you not serve me first? I mean, it's hard for people to understand. They go and take a plate and then they'll walk around into someplace else and take a plate. We spend so much time and energy trying to constrain the theft among pastors, because that's what a lot of the work of our staff does when we do conferences, is try to stop the theft among pastors. They're not witnesses. I mean, the church should not follow them. They should not look to them to say, this is what it looks like when somebody follows Christ. You look at the martyrs of the faith. You look at the people who we look back at, and you go, these are people that are doing something that you should look at and go, that's what I should follow. I should follow them as they follow Christ. That's not what you look at the Nigerian church for. You look at Conrad Mbewe, who's down in Zambia, and he goes, it's Nigeria that's destroying Africa because of all the garbage that's coming out of the Nigerian churches. He looks at it and he would know, right? He's from Africa, and he's saying this is the central point from which all the garbage flows out, like T.B. Joshua and these other people that are internationally known figures. And it's all false gospels. And these are the people that are dying.
And I mean, you went. A minute or two ago, you said that we're not just. The point isn't just to attack Nigeria, and because the reality is we should be warned by it. I mean, it's like when Christ said, when the tower fell on these people, was it for their sins? Like, well, the message for you is, unless you repent, you will likewise perish.
Right.
And so So when judgment is happening, for us to make it into a blessing to the church is confusion And it's destructive for them. You know, America after 9/11 shouldn't be saying, you know, we're such a holy nation, the Muslims hate us. All these, you know, we had thousands of martyrs on 9/11. That's not the message.
Right.
That's not what we should have been taking from it. We shouldn't have been taking, you know, we shouldn't be taking now. Where American church is holy, Nigerian church is wicked. You know, we should be taking, well, look at how bad the American church is. You know, we should use the time we have while we're spared to reform, to repent, and not to you know, follow in their footsteps and then receive the same judgment.
And specifically, the reason that I wanted to do this podcast is because the American church, looking at them, says they're Christians, which means the American church doesn't understand what Christianity is. When you have people like Knechtle going, these are Christians, and the church has no discernment to recognize that. And I'm not blaming him specifically because he's hearing from like evil organizations like Voice of the Martyrs, but other places they're talking about all this persecution that's going on. And it's just not true. But the church in America, it can't discern who Christians are, which is as big of a problem for the American church as it is that Nigeria. We're just not dying the same way, but the state of the church isn't that different.
And what happens is when you don't stop and think, you're not going to think properly about your sin either.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because American Christianity is in great shape. You know what I mean? It's not like we're going, Nigerian Christianity is in horrible shape and American Christianity is in great shape. We're headed, Nigeria might be headed up.
Right. There's signs that it is.
America's headed in the opposite direction, and there's this real part of it where...
Well, we can be optimistic.
I mean, I'm just saying...
Bad signs. There's plenty of bad signs you
at
can
the
look
moment,
at.
But there's a rise in
like
Calvinism, which has some positives.
But there's this part of it where if you don't think about these things, you're never going to actually examine your sin. You're never going to examine what it actually means. And you're not going to think. And God actually calls us to think.
And, you know, I mean, the way to think about it is if we're calling these people martyrs, I mean, people are probably saying, well, how do you know if these 52,000 people weren't martyrs? But you have to look, we have to start with some evidence. And to be a martyr, you have to be walking in the truth. So 1 John 1:6 says, if we say that we have fellowship with him and walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. And so we don't know about all 52, assuming that number is correct, about all 52,000. But when you get a large sample size of what we would consider good churches, and you have their pastors, and you get a very consistent behavior from that, you can make some generalizations about what the rest of the church, or the
just to give an idea,
church.
Our sample size is probably 30 or 40,000 pastors is the total sample size. It's not a small sample size.
And we've been going there over 10 years.
Yes.
So, I mean, this isn't like
I started going in 2014. And so that we have a large sample size.
And the places we're going are the places where where what they're calling persecution is at its highest. I mean, it's not like we're far away from it. We are...
Right, like driving down the road saying, oh yeah, that village was attacked, you know, last weekend.
Right.
Yeah.
That's not uncommon.
And so, and what's actually the most thing, and this is, this is one of the hopeful things about Nigeria, is frequently the attacks come within 1 to 5 months after I'm there. They come to the cities that I go. That's a very common pattern. And so you warn these people that they don't know Christ and they keep blaspheming his name, and they should expect the judgment of God, and then God sends judgment. This has happened repeatedly. And so we need to recognize that when the church is over going, oh, they're martyrs, this is so hateful towards the people over there. But to understand what's really happening, I was flying over there once, and I was sitting next to a Muslim on a plane. And I ended up talking to him. I don't usually talk to people on planes, but I ended up having a long conversation with him. And he was coming back from one of his wives, who was an American. And then he also has one in Nigeria, of course, because he's Muslim and she's Christian, quote unquote. He's going, I went to church with her while I was in America for 3 months, or it may have been 2 months. I don't remember exactly. And I went to those churches and went, who would ever be so perverse? And this is a man who has multiple wives. Going, who would ever do this, that this is just so filled with wickedness? Now, it was a prosperity gospel church that he was going to, obviously, and somebody that's not very serious, but she's a Christian, but not very serious because she married a Muslim, knowing he was a Muslim, not knowing that he'd take a second wife, but she could figure once she moved back to America, he'd take a second wife. Anybody over there would understand that. And so, but he's looking and going, I go into I go to a mosque and the imam would never commit adultery. He'd be rejected.
Yeah,
Openly.
easy to say. Easy to
Well,
say.
but
because Muslim countries are not known as pinnacles of righteousness. I mean,
they are not known as pinnacles of righteousness, but the point is that he could look and go, I know of all kinds of pastors that say it's evil, and they have mistresses, and they have children out of wedlock, and they're committing fornication. And he's looking and saying, and I agree that he's not looking at the Muslims and say, are they practicing as faithfully as the Christians? But he is looking at the Christians and saying, these people are very morally perverse. And those are the people that we're calling martyrs. They're not martyrs. This is why and it's the same reason that you look at, and again, I'm not saying they were righteous in attacking the towers in 9/11, but this is what they say. And there is truth that they look and they see all the nudity and they're offended by nudity and they want the woman to be covered up with everything. And we should be offended by the nudity, but it doesn't mean that you can only have a little slit that you look through. But at the same time, we're not offended at the nudity. And then we see them going, you're morally perverse. And we don't go, yeah, we're morally perverse. We're not Christian. We're not living like a Christian people.
And you look at, Babylon. God uses Babylon to judge Israel for Israel's sins, and then he judges Babylon for Babylon's wickedness and attacking Israel. So it's not to say that, well, God is using the Muslims to judge the Nigerian church, therefore the Muslims are great. No. I mean, the Muslims should expect judgment because they shouldn't be going after people, and as part of it, there's factors in play, but they should not be going after people because they're calling themselves Christian. That's wicked for them to do. And they should expect judgment.
Right. But we shouldn't turn around and say, because they call themselves Christians, therefore, this is not the judgment hand of God, that this is not the wrath of God. You have 50,000 people died. The first question should always be, is this the wrath of God? God is very angry when you take his name and you take it in vain. 2 Timothy 3:2-7. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power, and from such people turn away. For of this sort are those who creep into households and make captives of gullible women, loaded down with sins, led away by various lusts, always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. That is a description of the Nigerian church. That's such an apt description of the Nigerian church. They have this form of godliness. They say we're Christians. They go to church. They have prayer meetings where they have long hours of prayer where they finally break into speaking in tongues for 2 hours. And they think, oh, we're such a holy people. But they have no power over sin in general. And I'm not saying nobody there is saved. I'm saying that even the ones that are saved, they don't have much testimony, meaning that they aren't out there proudly saying, I am going to stand on truth.
Well, hopefully not proudly.
Sorry, that was a bad turn of phrase. So they're not saying there's nothing I can do except say what God says, that I need to follow him regardless of my risk of life. They're not saying that at all. Even those that are faithful are going, I read the Bible. Those who have evidence of faith, they go, I read the Bible and I don't really understand anything. This is where they are. This isn't like the martyrs of old where you go and they're moving the church forward. They're not moving the church forward. They're moving it backwards. There's a real rise. It talks about at the end of those verses how, they go in and lead away gullible women. I mean, most of the people that are quote unquote Christians in Nigeria are women for a reason, because those verses are playing itself out.
And in Matthew, when Christ talks about persecution, he's very clear about who he's talking about. Matthew 5, verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Persecution is not just when something bad is happening to you. It's when it's happening because you are righteous. And so if you don't have that testimony of righteousness, you should interpret it as judgment and not as true persecution.
So you look at most of the people were killed by two groups, which are really the same group, just different organizations, whether it's organized as guerrilla or organized as an army. But you have Boko Haram and the Fulanis. And Boko Haram is doing it to drive out Christians out of their state so that they can flip it to be a majority Muslim so they can install Sharia law. Nothing about the righteousness of the people or the offense of the people. The only offense of the people is they refuse to vote for Sharia law. Then it switched and became for the Fulanis. The Fulanis are the herdsmen in northern Nigeria, and they believe they have the right to take their cattle wherever they want to go. Well, the population in Nigeria is skyrocketing. It's increasing rapidly, which means you have more farms. And the Fulani are going, how dare you put up fences? How dare you plant crops where we're going to go? And this creates real tension, real problems, and real killings. All of it evil. But it's not about their righteousness. It's about wanting political power, and it's about wanting land or free use of land. And so those two things do not mean that you're a Christian martyr.
And with that first one, I mean, that could be legitimate persecution because political power is connected with religion. But when you look at the broader context and see, the sin of the church, then it's really harder to really call it persecution. Kind of going back to some, the Muslims versus the Christendom, say, in the years leading up to the Reformation, the centuries leading up, a lot of Europe was taken over by Muslims, and a lot of Christendom, even more of the non-Europe part of Christendom was taken over by Muslims. And that should have been a wake-up call so that the Reformation happened centuries earlier. And then I don't think nearly as much would have been taken over by Muslims. So they had the judgment coming upon them, and they were saying, we need to be warriors for Christ, we need to go fight the Muslims, instead of saying, are we following the scriptures? Instead, they follow the Pope into furthering their own destruction instead of repenting and reforming the errors that had built up in the church.
It's worth even mentioning what God's doing there, right? Because he's causing the Muslims to attack at the same time as the rise of Martin Luther. Martin Luther's doing all these writings, and the Pope says, I have to focus on driving the Muslims out, or they are going to take over all of Europe. And so that's why Luther gets this foothold, is because God is judging the Roman Catholic Church. If you looked at that and said they were martyrs for the faith, you've got it all backwards. God is using the Muslims to suppress the papacy so that Martin Luther's writings can expand because he's having trouble fighting both battles at the same time. Because the Muslims, he sees it as an existential threat. Right. He did not see Luther the same way.
One way you could describe this very accurately is these people who have been killed are enemies of the Muslims.
Yes.
And there are people who go, that's enough to call them there are people who go, the enemies of the Muslims are Christians. And if that's your position, well, you're wrong, and we're talking to you.
And that's why so much of the Nigerian church is not really a church at all, because they're just trying not to be Muslim. Well, that doesn't mean that you're Christians. They just are non-Muslims. And so, yes, they're trying to terrorize the non-Muslims. There's no question about that. That's evil. That's terrible. But that doesn't make them martyrs. I mean, one thing that the Biden administration and how they let in all these millions of refugees, and the way that they did it is that they were asylum seekers, and they granted them asylum. Well, asylum requires it to be the government persecuting you. But they said, if you're poor, that's the government persecuting you. If you have a husband that beats you, that's the government persecuting you. If you're afraid your children won't be able to find a job when they become of age, that's the government. So they took asylum and made asylum mean everything. Well, this is exactly what the church is doing with martyrs, where there is a biblical definition of what a martyr is, but the church is going, hey, we're just going to expand it and call everybody martyrs because then it makes us feel good because we're being persecuted.
Yeah, and if you look at those, again, at the 50 or 52,000 people, just like there should be a process where someone's seeking asylum and they have to, I'm not saying literally this, but they fill out paperwork and, you determine, are they really being persecuted by their government? I don't see any evaluation, even if it's not just every one by one, but an evaluation of the 52,000 to say, were these people even a Christian? Certainly in some cases there were young children that were killed, which is terrible. But were they even professing Christians? We don't know. So it's just this big number that gets thrown out without any just the example you gave, without any vetting or evaluation of, is this thing that we're calling a martyr, is it really that?
And nobody's even saying, what's the state of the church in Nigeria? Because when you look at the historical martyrs, Knechtle uses the term that the blood of the martyrs is what is it?
The seat of the church.
Is the seat of the church. I'm thinking it was something else for some reason. The blood of the martyrs is the seat of the church. Well, you actually have to be a martyr because you actually have to have a testimony of righteousness when the church is being faithful, so that people are laying down their lives like he said, which is right. You have to be willing to lay down your life. Christ says that. But if you're willing to lay down your life for your faith, that's one thing. But you also, if they're just killing you for the sake of killing you because they want to change the political landscape or because they want access to your farm, that's not laying your life down for the name of Christ. It's not being a martyr.
Or even if they just think you're a Christian and they want to kill you for, they may think that they're martyring you.
Right,
and you
but
may
it
not
doesn't
be
matter because you're not testifying. So if the American church would just look at the Nigerian church, they would go, look at all the garbage that's coming back from Nigeria. Look at all the stuff that's being exported. It doesn't take much looking at the church in Nigeria to go, why would we think any of these people are martyrs? It's that we don't want to look. We just want to go, there's been more martyrs now than ever before.
People could say, well, how technical do you have to be? Because I would even say that we don't need to go into details, but one of the famous, Reformation martyrs wasn't a Christian. But putting that aside, the bigger issues is we've lost the idea of judgment on Christian, quote unquote, Christian nations. And so that's why it's it's not that we need to absolutely know everyone's salvation or we can't call them a martyr. But we've just we've lost that concept entirely, and so we just don't even think about that. We assume they must be martyrs because they were Christians and they were killed. They must be martyrs.
And I think that a lot of it is Voice of the Martyr has been pushing their propaganda for a long time, where their propaganda is you're a Christian martyr even if you just happen to live in a neighborhood where other Christians or so-called Christians were, even if you don't believe anything that would be considered Orthodox Christianity. If somehow you're even tertiarily connected to Christ, then you're a martyr. Well, that's great for fundraising when you're called Voice of the Martyrs. That's terrific for fundraising, but it's horrible for the church. It's very destructive for the church because, again, like you said, I mean, there are people that testified of their faith when they didn't have faith. But it comes from a place where people at least had knowledge and they had truth and there was truth being spoken. I mean, I've argued with 180 seminary professors, and the vast majority of them, or the significant majority of them, they had no idea of the gospel. And these are their seminary professors. And so to pretend like they're out there and they have this church that's testifying, it's not the people responding to the faithfulness of the church. It's not them responding to the preaching of the gospel. It's them responding because they have other agendas. It's important for us to see this. One of the things that when I go over to Nigeria, I hear all these Americans go over there, and a lot of it is prosperity gospel people. And they go over there and say, oh, this is so wonderful. You're dying for your faith. It is so evil towards those people. Because if you can't discern what judgment is, then you don't see the need for repentance. And if you don't see the need for repentance, you should just expect the judgment to get worse. This is what God did with Israel, with the nation of Israel in Deuteronomy 28:56-66. If you do not carefully observe all the words of this law that are written in this book, that you may fear this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God, then the Lord will bring upon you and your descendants extraordinary plagues, great and prolonged plagues, and serious and prolonged sicknesses. Moreover, he will bring back on you all the diseases of Egypt, of which you were afraid, and they shall cling to you. Also every sickness and every plague which is not written in the book of the law will the Lord bring upon you until you are destroyed. You shall be left few in number, whereas you were as the stars of heaven in multitude, because you would not obey the voice of the Lord your God. And it shall be that just as the Lord rejoiced over you to do you good and multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to destroy you and to bring you to nothing, and you shall be plucked from off the land which you go to possess. Then the Lord will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other. And there you shall serve other gods, which neither you nor your fathers have known, wood and stone. And among those nations you shall find no rest, nor shall the sole of your foot have a resting place. But there the Lord will give you a trembling heart, failing eyes, and anguish of soul. For your life shall hang in doubt before you. You shall fear day and night and have no assurance of life. And God says, I did this to Israel so that you see and fear. And our response is, when the people are being so obviously judged for their blasphemy, obviously judged because they have a form of godliness but do not believe in any power. They believe it makes you rich, and they're a very poor country. And so they mock God, they blaspheme God, they're being judged by God. And the American church's response is, oh, you're martyrs. It's so evil to them. What they need to hear is, you keep saying you're Christians and you don't live like it in any way, shape, or form. You need to repent, or God's anger is upon you. That's the message they need to hear. And the American churches want to say, oh, you're so wonderful, you're martyrs, which just means people are going to keep dying.
And I think Joshua's point was really relevant, where he said people have lost, the church has lost the idea of God judging Christians. And I would go even further, is that a lot of the professing church abhors the idea of God judging anything.
Right.
And so to judge Christians would be even
I remember
more severe.
Some time ago when we went through a church split, I was talking to an elder of another church, and I said, just watch. You'll see. God judges evil, and he's going to judge that church. Just watch and see the health problems that they have and the financial problems. Just sit back and watch. He goes, God can never do that. It's like, of course, that's what...
God would never do that, right?
Right. and it's like, have you never read the Bible? This is what God does. But this is a Reformed Baptist, and he's saying God could never do that. That's where the church is. They just reject the idea that God judges people who blaspheme his name by calling themselves Christians when they don't live like Christians.
And what happens is you end up calling people to be, you call them to pride, because in the end they're being judged, and instead you tell them you're being persecuted for righteousness' sake. And what it really reminds me of, in a sense, is it reminds me of, I think what's at play, one of the things that's in play here is the exportation of American evangelicalism's view of profession of salvation. Mm-hmm. You know, because you move
easy
from,
believism is
you
what
move
you're
from the
saying,
doctrine of once saved, always saved, to once professed, always saved, which is not scriptural. And then you tell people, if you've professed, you cling to that, you hold to that in spite of any other evidence. So you see yourself going out and sinning, you see yourself going out and living and doing these things, you believe you are saved. You see God judging you, don't think God could be judging you. You hold to the fact that you're being persecuted, you're righteous. And so there's this whole idea of calling people to pride, as opposed to actually recognizing what sin is and recognizing what actual righteousness is. And if you're an American and you find what we're talking about offensive, one of the reasons you probably find it offensive is because to evaluate Nigeria, you have to evaluate yourself. And as soon as you start saying that can be evaluated, as soon as you start saying you can think about righteousness, you start to go, wait a minute, do I know what righteousness is? Wait a minute, do we? And so the whole thrust of it is don't think, don't ask, don't consider it, because if you start considering it, you're going to start to wonder if you understand who God is.
I mean, in Isaiah 5 should cause people in America to be concerned, because they hear, oh, they're martyrs. Isn't that, it's just, look at this. God's causing so many martyrs for the faith. Isaiah 5:20-21 says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. This is what the American church is doing. They're looking at these people who are being judged by God because they're perverting and blaspheming his name, and they're calling it good. God says, I judge people for this. Woe to you, sorrow to you, misery to you. But we're so busy being wise in our own eyes, where we are so wise that we don't need any evidence, we don't need any knowledge, we don't need to understand what's going on for us to say, they're martyrs. That's being wise in your own eyes and prudent in your own sight. That is, God says, I produce woe. So when we read that verse, we should recognize the woe on the American church, Yes, the Nigerian church is, the professed church, the visible church, if you will, in Nigeria is suffering great woe. They've had lots of terrorism against it. We shouldn't go, God would never do that here. Of course he would.
I think that's a really important part of why we're doing the podcast. If you're listening and you're thinking, well, we're just beating up on Nigeria and we're being judgmental about these 52,000 people and all of that. It says, woe to those who call good evil and evil good. And so if they're not martyrs and we don't examine it and call it out, as we have said throughout, we're doing a great disservice to people who might hear something and go, oh, okay, that must be right. I don't have time to research that. And so I assume that's true.
Or people are lying to them and they don't care, or they haven't researched, or they haven't bothered, like Voice of the Martyrs, and they go, these are martyrs. But they don't even look at what Voice of the Martyrs actually believes and actually holds, that this is what it means to be a martyr.
And I think it's important to look at that attitude towards God's judgment. I think people frequently, like you said, they frequently dismiss the idea. And it makes me kind of think about like David when Absalom takes over the kingdom and David's run out and Shimei comes out and he's mocking David. David knows he's being punished. God told him the sword's not going to leave your house, right? And so David knows, not that Shimei is righteous, not that Absalom's righteous, but David knows he's being punished. And David's attitude towards that punishment is to be humble.
Right.
You know what I mean? And to take the punishment. And even to, when the guys are going to go kill Shimei, he's like, no. I mean, and I think we don't have that mindset in America. There's just part of it where, and I do think it's really important when something happens to you, when we see something happen, our first thought shouldn't be to accept the political narrative. Our first,
Well, and very related to that is, and often the political narrative is pushed forth by people who claim to be leaders in the church. Cliffe Knechtle, he's going, this is happening. There's lots of people that have seen his videos about him evangelizing on campuses and stuff and goes, wow, if he says that, I'm going to believe it. And that's incredibly irresponsible to be doing this. And they're looking towards sources and just blindly following, where that's what happens so often in the American church, is that we just blindly follow and that we don't actually think things through. We don't ask the questions that we should ask. We don't check for legitimate sources. We just go, hey, I like how that sounds, so let's promote that. Let's push that. We don't care about truth.
And I remember recently, I think you were preaching a sermon about judgment, and you go, America needs to realize we've been under judgment for a period of time. Like God talks in the Old Testament, and he says, if you give you a king, one of the things that I'm going to do that's going to be hard is the king's going to charge you 10% tax. When's the last time we had 10% tax in the U.S.? He says, I'm going to cause women to rule over you. When has this started to happen in the United States? I'm going to cause your children to rule over you. When is and you look at the pattern of things that have happened in America, and the issue is when you should understand that our temptation to look at them is a temptation to avoid the fact that we're under judgment as well. We don't want to analyze it. We don't want to see it, because in the end, not understanding it, it causes you to be blind to the hand of God. If you're looking, when we go to the abortion clinic, one of the passages we'll read is from Psalm 10. And it talks about how the wicked goes, my ways are always prospering. Your judgments are out of their sight. And the truth, they're being judged, and they cannot see it. They can't even imagine it. And so here we're being tempted to be a part of the people who hide the judgment of God, so in another place, so that we don't see God's judgment on ourselves. And we need to understand how this is how sin works.
In that feedback loop, because that feedback loop is real, meaning that still throughout the world, America is looked at as the bastion of Christianity. And when the Americans are going, these are martyrs, the rest of the world is going, we should be looking at, and there's a big problem with America being the bastion of Christianity to begin with. Right. But even beyond that, what we're doing by looking at that and calling them martyrs is we're promoting that blindness and that ignorance to the world. It's hard for people in America to understand the influence that the American church has on the rest of the world. And unfortunately, it hasn't been that much better than the effect of Hollywood on the world. The gospel that we're preaching is a false gospel in most places in the world that we've exported. It's been very damaging. And so, but other people are looking, going, this is the example. And so they're saying these are martyrs. So therefore, we should be listening to these people.
What's the question you got from someone about homosexuality in the United States?
Right. Since America has embraced homosexuality, and clearly 98% of Americans are Christians, I read the Bible and it says homosexuality is wrong. I don't understand. How did you come to that conclusion? How am I misreading the Bible?
Because America must be right. America's Christian. I should follow America.
Right. And so, in 2 Corinthians 4, 1-6, it says, therefore, since we have this ministry, as we have received mercy, we do not lose heart. We have renounced the hidden things of shame, not walking in craftiness or handling the word of God deceitfully, but by manifestation of the truth, commending ourselves to every man's conscience in the sight of God. But even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, whose minds the God of this age has blinded, who do not believe, lest the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine on them. For we do not preach ourselves, but Christ Jesus the Lord, and ourselves your bondservants for Jesus' sake. For it is God who commanded light to shine out of darkness, who has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. It has to be connected to knowledge. It has to be connected to information. When we're pushing forward these things, we're actually pushing forward the blindness of the gods of this age. That's what we're pushing out in the world when we say these things. We shouldn't look at it as somehow neutral. Jesus Christ is the truth. If we don't care about truth, we don't care about Christ. If we push out these things, we're doing the work of the gods of this world and not of the true and living God. And that's what the American church is doing, and it's affecting the whole world. And we need to recognize our culpability of this, and woe to those who call good evil and evil good.
Right, because there's this part of it where you have to step back and you go, God is doing something in the world. Like right now, God is doing something in the world. And if you accept the narrative that what God is doing is he is strengthening the church by persecuting Christians in Nigeria, that they are being righteous, that is righteousness, and they are being persecuted for the cause of righteousness. If you accept that narrative, then you have to go, this is what righteousness looks like.
Right.
And that means something. That starts to mean real thing. And then you go, then the American church is even more righteous, because the American church is in a better state right now than the Nigerian church. So you go, you know what I mean?
It's a mix, but yes.
But you know what I mean?
There's American churches that accept homosexuality,
right,
and the Nigerian church wouldn't, largely.
But I'm saying, so there's this part where if you accept that narrative, you go, maybe we need to fix some things, but we're in pretty good shape.
And we'd also go, the pastor lied. He was committing an affair, but it was just a lie.
Whereas
he extorted money from the church, but why would we do anything about that? That happens in Nigeria all the time, right? I mean, you just it just creates this acceptance of sin, and it is in the American church. We're the ones that export it to Nigeria, and we've made them twice the sons of hell that we are. But those same attitudes are here, and this strengthens those attitudes where the true believer should be going, no, that's not right. Truth is what matters, because truth is Christ.
But if you go, they're under judgment and we're under judgment, you come away with a very different thing that should be done. What should we be doing is we should be humbling ourselves and repenting before the Lord. And it doesn't mean that God isn't strengthening his church, but if you think about it the wrong way, you actually harm the work that God is doing, as opposed to recognizing the work that he's doing and obeying it. And so, I mean, that's why this matters. I mean, it matters because if you don't understand it, God's going to judge you more.
And so if we look, he referenced the long-held saying, right? The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. This is how the church grows, is through the martyrs shedding their blood. But that's only true when truth is expressed. You look at Martin Luther, right? We wouldn't call him a martyr because he didn't die, but he was a martyr. He was a greater martyr than most martyrs are because he stood before the Holy Roman Emperor and said, I have to stand on the word of God. Here I stand. I can do no other. And that's probably not a, well, he said it in German, so it's definitely not a quote, but that's a decent paraphrase of what his position was. And that caused people to go, when the Holy Roman Emperor tried to kill him, that caused people to go, wow, there's people who care enough about the truth that they're willing to die for the truth. This is a different religion. Yeah, I'm sure on the podcast I mentioned it before. Attendance at mosques went up after 9/11 because people said, wow, here's a religion that people are willing to die for. It must have some credibility to it. When you say people are dying just because they want a farm rather than run cattle, I'm sorry, that's no credibility. But when you go, like the Covenanters, where 18,000 of them died and were killed because they said, we will not kneel before the elements because they are not to be worshipped like the Roman Catholics say. That we won't, the elements of the Lord's table, that we won't bow before the bread. We won't treat them like idols. And they were killed for that. And the church expanded and grew and got more powerful. But it only works to be the seat of the truth of the church when it is based on truth and it is based on saying, I will shed my blood to stand on truth. That's what's required for it to be effective. It's truth that transforms. It's not the blood of the martyrs that transform. It's truth and somebody who's willing to say, I am willing to die rather than to deny Jesus Christ, rather than to deny truth.
And what you're saying is the person doesn't have to die to be a witness.
Oh, definitely not. But Luther was willing to die.
Right.
He knew when he said that he would die. It's just that, obviously people stepped in and stopped that. But that's what happens. That's why you look at after Huss dies, where he does the same thing, only they actually kill him. All of a sudden, the church in what's modern-day Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic, gets to be very strong after that, like very strong. So that the emperor tries to destroy it for decades and can do nothing against it. I mean, that's what it looks like when the blood of martyrs is the seat of the church. It's based on truth, and it's based on real testimony. It's based on true martyrdom. It's not based on somebody calling themselves a Christian and then God judging them.
A couple things that come to mind. One is that the truth will set you free. The truth is what actually brings freedom. But specifically to this, in Ephesians 4:13 through 16, till we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, that we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the trickery of men and the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting, but speaking the truth in love, may grow up in all things into him who is the head, Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by what every joint supplies, according to the effective working by which every part does its share, causes growth of the body for the edifying of itself in love. I mean, the Bible says that Jesus Christ is truth. Jesus Christ is what, and so the truth is what will cause the growth of the church. It's what will, just like if someone professes faith and they say the name Jesus Christ, but they're naming a different gospel, it's just like it's just like them worshiping the golden calf and calling it Jehovah.
Right.
It's not, you're not worshiping the true God. And so the truth of who you're worshiping, of who you believe in, has to be consistent with who God is, or it doesn't matter.
And, when it talks about edifying of itself in love, Paul in 1 Corinthians 14 says exactly how it's edified. It's edified with truth. This is why it says don't want desire to speak in tongues, desire to prophesy, because it's by prophesying, by telling truth, by speaking, by being a witness, by saying the truth of who God is. That's how the church will be edified. And so when you accept lies, it never edifies the church. What edifies and strengthens the church and causes the growth of the body is truth. And when somebody's willing to die for truth, other people look at it and say, wow, I should be willing to die for truth too. He did not deny Christ. And you look at the martyrs, you read Fox's Book of Martyrs, and there's these people there that are watching these martyrs. And usually true martyrdom is just one or two people or a handful of people. It's not, I mean, there are cases like the Covenanters where it's a large number, but that's not usually the case. Usually the government, as Joshua was saying before, they take somebody and they want to set them as an example. So they put them in a situation that they know that they could not withstand, because they'd go, yeah, I'll say whatever I can so that I don't get burned alive in a very painful process. And they stand there and they refuse to recant. They say, no, the Pope is the Antichrist. It is not, that is a false gospel. And they burn to death. And the people go, wow, truth matters. And that's not what's happening with the quote unquote persecution in Nigeria. People are saying truth doesn't matter.
I mean, one of the things I think that it's easy to overlook about martyrdom, or even just your witness of who God is and your witness of salvation in your life, is that it's always a gift of God. I mean, in the sense that if you think about it, it's an outworking of salvation, which people sometimes think of salvation as beginning as this gift of God, but it's the whole way through. It's something that He does in your life. You can't manufacture martyrdom. You can't manufacture a circumstance, and it's God doesn't give many people the opportunity to suffer for Him in that way. And when you read a passage like Matthew 10:32 through 38, it's really easy for us to think wrongly about what it means to confess Him before men. Sometimes it's just saying a few words here and there is the way we think about it. But when you look at this passage, it's about that your confession is in your life. It's that you are able to, He puts you in a circumstance that allows you to live out your salvation before men. It says, therefore, whoever confesses me before men, him I will also confess before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, him I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven. Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. And so there's a part of it where, I mean, we all have an opportunity to live in these ways before other people. I mean, and God's even saying He's going to make it so there are situations. This is where so many people fall away from the faith. When you look at the parable of the sower and it talks about the cares of the world choking them out. Sometimes the cares of the world is your children don't want to follow after you, and to stay in their life, you say I have to stop serving God. You have difficulty with your wife, and you're going to either lose your wife or you're going to stop serving God. And this is one of the reasons why when we talk about how even though Christ is coming to destroy sin and that the world will continue to get better, there will always be persecution, because when you have to stand against those who you love, those who are part of your family, when you have to say, I'm willing to lose my relationship with you and everything about it for the cause of Christ, that's incredibly painful. But we shouldn't think that this is just looking at him and going, I'm a Christian. We shouldn't think this requires just looking at him and saying, I believe in God. It requires losing that relationship and being willing to let it, your wife might divorce you because you decide to follow after Christ. Your children might forsake you. You may have to it'd be a war every single time you go and you have these types of relationships with people. But it's really easy just to forget that that's the level at which God says confessing His name is. Those who are martyrs aren't just in a local setting. God lifts them up so that others can see them. They can look at them and go, this person is living their life in this way. And God causes the events of their life so that it becomes like when He talks about that you don't you don't take a candle and put it under a basket. You lift it up so that everyone in the house can see it. That's what God does with those who He calls martyrs, is He lifts them up so that other people can see their faith.
I think one of the things that you made me think of, Charles, is that the testimony of whether someone is a martyr isn't just by their death. It's what was their life before that.
And even our definition, our modern definition of martyr, which means that you died for your faith, that's a really bad definition. It is really that you testified to your faith.
Right.
And some people testify to their faith by dying. But the reality is here, right, and he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. They all knew what take up your cross meant. That meant accept the death penalty, because the cross was the death penalty. I mean, this is saying be willing to accept the death penalty. It doesn't mean that you have to receive the death penalty, which is what Knechtle accurately said, right, is that when you preach the gospel, you have to be willing to lose your life. That's what Christ is saying here. But the point isn't that you lost your life. It's that you did it for his sake. You lived your life, even at the risk of dying. And if you don't live your life to bring glory and honor to him, then it doesn't matter if you die or not. You're not a martyr.
Which, but I mean, some of that comes back to the language, because the Greek word martyr, that martyr comes from, is usually translated witness and has nothing to do with dying. But then our English word is to do with dying. And so don't go around calling yourself a martyr just because you're a witness to Christ. You're not a martyr because English words have meanings. So don't go there.
But it is like when you look at Hebrews where he says you haven't resisted yet to bloodshed. He doesn't say that means I'm guaranteeing each of you will have the opportunity to resist unto bloodshed. But he's also going, if you do, you should be, continue in this path. I mean, and so we're not all going to have the opportunity to die for Christ. It's not. I think it's right to think of it that God doesn't give most Christians that opportunity.
And understand what it says about God if most Christians are dying for Christ. I mean, it really says something pretty cruel and vicious about God. And God is not like that. I mean, God does say, for the sake of my bride and out of love for my bride and out of care for the elect, I will cause people to die. But it's a rare circumstance. It's not you're going, oh, look at this persecution through this whole nation. When you look and you say, look at how many martyrs there are, woo! You're really saying, look at how cruel God is. Because if the church isn't flourishing because of that, and the church in Nigeria is not flourishing because of these 52,000 that died, not at all.
Oh, in Nigeria, they know what it's
they
about.
Know
they know what it's about.
They know the church is not flourishing. They know that it is not, that the blood of the martyrs is not the seed of the church in Nigeria. They all know this. It's a breakdown of the prosperity gospel. It's actually causing people to be able to listen to the true gospel because they're going, wait a second, you said we'd get rich, and instead the Muslims are throwing us out of our homes. It's actually driving them to go, we don't know the gospel.
Which is what judgment is supposed to do.
Which is what judgment is supposed to do.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, you get a lot of pushback at conferences, but the pushback is over like women speaking in church, drinking alcohol, not being always wrong. But they don't really seem to push back much on saying the Muslims are coming as judgment on you, not to see how great you are. I mean, when I've been there, I've never heard people really push back on that. I
have had people push back on that, and once in Gombe, which is close to where Boko Haram was and stuff, or is. But in Gombe, they were pushing back on me, and I said, wait, stop. I can prove to you this is about blasphemy of the name of God. You're all persecuted. If you lived your life exactly the same, only you said, I follow Islam, the persecution would completely stop. The persecution is not because of righteousness' sake. The persecution is because you're blaspheming the name of Christ. And if you stop, the persecution will stop. And they all went, oh, you're right. Having Americans lie to them, and most of the missionaries that get sent over there by places like Voice of the Martyr, they just simply lie to them. And they prop them up and tell them that this judgment is just the cruelty of God, the wickedness of God. And so that's why it's happening. There's nothing you can do about it. Nothing's changing because of it. People are just dying. You're losing your land. You're losing your political power. You're losing everything. But this is the mercy of God. And it's so farcical that anybody looking at it that has their eyes open at all goes, this is nuts. But yet, there's lots of people in Nigeria that want to hear that, and there's lots of people in America that want to say that, and it's just destroying a nation. Church needs to be a lot slower about calling people martyrs. If they have a testimony that's actually causing the church to transform, that's what historical martyrdom has done. It's caused people to take things seriously that they weren't taking seriously before. That they go, this is a man who's testifying, or this is a woman who's saying, I cannot forsake Christ. So that people are so caught up in that they go, I need to follow that God. I need to have that much faith that I can live like that. That's what martyrdom looks like, not the fake martyrdom where people go, oh, there's more martyrs in the 20th century. There's more martyrs in the 21st century. Real martyrdom does cause the church to grow and to mature. This martyrdom's not doing that. Thanks for joining us.
This has been The Conquering Truth, a project of Reformation Baptist Church. If you found this helpful, you can visit us online at theconqueringtruth.com and subscribe here or in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for watching.